Granny waved to the royal guard every day. 5 years later, something amazing happened. The morning air was crisp with autumn's first breath when Daniel Carter adjusted his bearskin cap for the 100th time. At 24, he was one of the youngest members of the guards, and the weight of tradition still felt heavy on his shoulders. The legendary stoicism required of his position had become second nature during his 2 years of service, but sometimes, in moments like these, he caught himself fighting the urge to scratch his nose or shift his weight from one aching foot to the other. The palace gates loomed before him, a masterpiece of gilded ironwork that separated the ordinary from the extraordinary. Tourists gathered in growing clusters, their cameras clicking incessantly, their chatter a constant background hum. Daniel had learned to tune them out, to focus on the rhythm of his own breathing, the precise angle of his chin, the perfect stillness that the job demanded. But there was one person he could never quite ignore. She appeared every morning at precisely 8:45 a.m., as predictable as the changing of the guard itself. Eleanor Thompson, though Daniel didn't know her name yet, was a diminutive figure with silver hair always neatly pinned back, wearing a different colored cardigan each day but carrying the same weathered leather handbag. Unlike the tourists who jostled for selfies or tried to provoke a reaction, she simply stood in the same spot, a respectful distance from the gates, and waved. The first time Daniel noticed her, he assumed she was just another visitor. The second time, he thought perhaps she lived nearby. By the end of his first week at this post, he realized she was different. Her wave wasn't the excited gesture of a tourist or the casual acknowledgement of a local. It was deliberate, dignified, and somehow deeply personal, as if she were greeting an old friend. "Good morning, young man," she would say softly, though protocol prevented him from responding. Her voice carried the warmth of fresh-baked bread and Sunday afternoon tea. "I hope you're keeping well today." Through summer downpours, she came with a floral umbrella that had seen better days. During winter's bitter chill, she wrapped herself in a thick wool coat that had probably been fashionable decades ago. When spring brought its unexpected snow flurries, she wore boots that seemed too heavy for her delicate frame. But she never missed a day. Other guards noticed her too, of course. "Barmy old bird," Private Jenkins had commented during their break. "Probably lonely, nothing better to do." But there was something in her eyes that suggested otherwise, a clarity, a purpose that Daniel couldn't quite decipher. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Daniel found himself anticipating her arrival, though his face remained impassive. He noticed small details, how she would adjust her glasses before waving, the way she seemed to stand straighter despite her age, the slight tremor in her hand that grew more pronounced on colder days. One particularly memorable morning, a group of rowdy teenagers had knocked into her, nearly sending her frail form sprawling onto the pavement. Daniel's muscles had tensed, every fiber of his being wanting to break protocol and help her. But before he could move, she had steadied herself with remarkable grace, straightened her cardigan, pale blue that day, and resumed her position with a dignity that silenced even the boisterous teens. "Not to worry, dear," she had said, though Daniel hadn't moved a muscle. "These old bones are sturdier than they look." It became a strange sort of dance, her unwavering presence and his rigid stillness. Though duty prevented him from acknowledging her, he found himself drawing strength from her consistency. On days when his legs ached from standing at attention, when the weight of the bearskin cap seemed unbearable, when the tourist cameras felt more invasive than usual, her quiet dignity reminded him of why he had chosen this path. The other guards began to rotate their positions to avoid what they called the brandy posts, but Daniel volunteered for it whenever possible. He told himself it was because he preferred the morning shift, but deep down, he knew better. In a job that required him to be more stature than man, her gentle presence had become an anchor to his humanity. Sometimes, during the long hours of his shift, he would catch fragments of her conversations with other tourists. She spoke of her late husband, a veteran who had served in his own time. Of her grandchildren, scattered across the globe but always in her thoughts. Of her deep respect for tradition and duty. Each snippet added another layer to the mystery of why she came every day, rain or shine. One morning, As autumn painted the trees in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, she arrived wearing a metal pin to her cardigan, forest green that day. It wasn't until his break that Daniel learned from the chatty tea vendor nearby that it was Remembrance Day. The medal, he discovered, had belonged to her husband. She had worn it with the same quiet pride with which she carried herself every day. That evening, as Daniel finally relaxed in his small flat, he found himself thinking about her again. He had guarded priceless treasures, stood watch over ancient ceremonies, been part of events that would be recorded in history books. Yet somehow, this elderly woman's daily ritual had become the most meaningful part of his duty. In the months that followed, he noticed her steps growing slower, her breath a little more labored on the short walk from the nearby bus stop. Still, she came. Still, she waved. Still, she stood there with unwavering dedication, as if her presence was as essential to the palace routine as the changing of the guard itself. What Daniel couldn't know then was how the simple act of standing guard would soon entangle his life with hers in ways he could never have imagined. He couldn't know that the comfortable routine they had established was about to be shattered, or that the true test of his duty would have nothing to do with standing still and everything to do with movement, the movement of his heart. October had painted London in shades of amber and rust when Daniel first noticed something was wrong. The morning air held that peculiar crispness that heralded winter's approach, and fallen leaves skittered across the palace grounds like nature's confetti. As Daniel marched into position at precisely 8:30 a.m., his boots crunching on scattered leaves, he felt an unfamiliar tension in his shoulders. 8:45 a.m. came and went. The spot where Eleanor usually stood remained empty. "She's just running late," he told himself, maintaining his stoic expression even as his eyes darted to every elderly woman who passed by. The morning crowd swelled and ebbed like a predictable tide, but none of the faces belonged to her. By 9:30 a.m., the knot in his stomach had tightened. In 2 years, she had never been late, let alone absent. Even during the tube strike, she had somehow made her way to her usual spot, slightly out of breath but wearing a triumphant smile that suggested the journey had been quite an adventure. The next day, Daniel arrived early, hoping to catch sight of her approaching from one of the nearby streets. The autumn morning was particularly beautiful, the kind Eleanor would have appreciated. But 8:45 a.m. came again, and her absence felt like a shadow cast over the sunlit grounds. As the days stretched into a week, Daniel began noticing all the things he'd taken for granted. The morning light seemed harsher without her presence to soften it. The tourist cameras felt more intrusive, their voices more grating. Even his uniform, typically a source of pride, felt heavier somehow. He found himself studying the faces in the crowd with an intensity that would have surprised his commanding officer. Each elderly woman who approached the gates caused his heart to leap, only to sink again when he realized it wasn't her. Some days he imagined he caught a glimpse of her familiar cardigan in the distance, but it always turned out to be someone else. The other guards noticed the change in him. During their break, Private Jenkins attempted a joke. "Missing your #1 fan, Carter?" But there was an undercurrent of concern in his voice that suggested even he had grown used to the old woman's presence. 2 weeks into her absence, Daniel began to notice other small changes in the daily routine he never paid attention to before. The flower vendor who usually set up near Eleanor's spot had taken to glancing at the empty space with a worried frown. The local bobby who patrolled the area would pause slightly when passing the spot, as if expecting to exchange a morning greeting that no longer came. The tourists continued their endless rotation, pointing, photographing, attempting to provoke reactions. A young boy, no more than 7, tugged at his mother's sleeve one morning and asked, "Where's the nice lady who always waves?" Daniel's throat tightened at the child's innocent question, but his face remained impassive. As autumn deepened, the weather turned bitter. Icy winds whipped around the palace gates, and the crowds thinned. Daniel found himself hoping that Eleanor had simply decided the weather was too harsh for her daily visit. Perhaps she was sitting in a warm living room somewhere, planning to return when spring brought gentler days. But deep down, he knew better. Eleanor had stood in her spot through far worse weather, through summer heatwaves that had tourists fainting, through winter storms that had everyone else running for shelter. No, something was wrong. During his breaks, he began paying closer attention to the conversations around him. The newspaper vendor mentioned something about an ambulance in the area a few days before Eleanor's disappearance. The coffee cart owner recalled seeing her looking more tired than usual on her last few visits. One particularly cold morning, as Daniel stood at his post, an elderly man approached the gates. For a moment, Daniel's heart raced. The man carried the same dignified bearing that Eleanor had always shown. But instead of stopping at her usual spot, the man walked right up to the gates. "Excuse me, young man," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of concern. "I couldn't help but notice. The lady who used to stand here every morning, she hasn't been around lately. We often shared the same bus, you see. She never missed a day, never." His voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken worry. Daniel maintained his required silence, but his mind was racing. The man's words confirmed what he had feared. Eleanor's absence wasn't just noticed by those at the palace. She had touched many lives during her daily journey, creating a web of connections that only became visible now that she was gone. The palace grounds felt different without her. The magnificent gates, the pristine gardens, the historical grandeur, it all seemed colder somehow, more institutional. Eleanor's presence had added something intangible but essential, like a warm hearth in a grand but chilly manner. As November drew to a close, Daniel realized that what he missed most wasn't just the ritual of her daily appearance. It was the way she had humanized his role without ever compromising it. In a job that required him to be detached and distant, she had somehow acknowledged both the uniform and the man wearing it. The morning crowd continued its eternal cycle. Tourists came and went, locals hurried past, life moved on. But for Daniel, standing rigid at his post, something fundamental had shifted. The absence of Eleanor's wave had created a void that no amount of pomp and ceremony could fill. What he didn't know then was that his growing concern would soon drive him to break the very protocols he had sworn to uphold. The mystery of Eleanor's disappearance was about to lead him down a path that would challenge everything he understood about duty, connection, and the true meaning of service. The decision to break his silence came during a particularly bitter December morning. Daniel had just finished his shift, his muscles aching from standing motionless in the cold, when he noticed the tea vendor, Mr. Patel, packing up his cart earlier than usual. Something about the old man's worried expression made Daniel pause. Before he could second-guess himself, he was already walking toward the cart, still in his full ceremonial uniform. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice hoarse from disuse during his shift. "The elderly lady who used to stand here every morning." "Ah, Mrs. Eleanor." Mr. Patel's face lit up with recognition before darkening with concern. "Such a kind soul. Always bought her morning chai, she did. Extra ginger, no sugar. Said it reminded her of her travels in India with her late husband." Daniel's heart quickened at this small detail about Eleanor's life. "Do you know what happened to her?" Mr. Patel's hands stilled on his cart. "It was a nasty business that morning. I saw it happen, you know. She was standing in her usual spot, but something was different. She seemed unsteady." He shook his head, the memory clearly troubling him. "Next thing I knew, she was on the ground. Hit her head pretty bad on the pavement. The ambulance came quick, but—" He trailed off, gesturing helplessly. "Which hospital?" Daniel asked, already reaching for his phone. "St. Mary's, I think. But that was weeks ago. Haven't heard anything since." Daniel spent his break calling every major hospital in the area. At St. Mary's, a sympathetic nurse could only tell him that a patient matching Eleanor's description had been transferred to a care facility. No other details could be shared due to privacy policies. That evening, instead of heading home, Daniel found himself visiting every nursing home within a 5-mile radius of the palace. Still in his uniform, he hadn't had time to change. He drew curious looks from staff and residents alike. At each facility, he described Eleanor, her silver hair, her colorful cardigans, her gentle demeanor. Most administrators were apologetic but unhelpful. At the 4th facility, an elderly resident overheard his description. "Oh, the palace lady! she exclaimed. She told us all about her morning waves when she first arrived. Such a lovely story. Shame about her condition, though. They moved her to Meadowbrook Care Home last week. Meadowbrook was on the outskirts of London, a Victorian mansion converted into a modern care facility. By the time Daniel arrived, visiting hours were nearly over. The young receptionist took one look at his uniform and straightened in her chair. "I'm looking for a resident who was recently transferred here," Daniel explained. "Her name is Eleanor. She used to wave at the palace guards every morning." The receptionist finished, surprising him. "She mentioned it during admission. Actually, she mentions it quite often now." A shadow crossed her face. "Are you family?" "No, I'm..." Daniel hesitated. How could he explain what he was? A guard who had never spoken to her? A stranger who had come to depend on her daily presence? "I'm the guard she used to wave to." Something in his voice must have conveyed his sincerity, because the receptionist's professional demeanor softened. "Room 214. But I should warn you, she's been having difficult days." The corridor to room 214 seemed endless. Daniel passed residents in wheelchairs, nurses pushing medication carts, rooms filled with the sound of television shows and quiet conversations. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air, barely masking the underlying scent of age and illness. He found Eleanor sitting by a window, wrapped in a pale blue blanket that reminded him of one of her cardigans. The setting sun cast long shadows across her face, highlighting how much weight she had lost. A half-eaten dinner tray sat on the table beside her. "Mrs. Eleanor?" he said softly, stepping into the room. She turned slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. Her eyes, once so bright and alert, seemed clouded with confusion. "Are you from the palace?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Daniel Carter. You used to..." He swallowed hard. "You used to wave to me every morning." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then smiled vaguely. "The palace is very beautiful in the morning. My herald always said so. He's away on duty now, you know. Such a handsome man in his uniform, just like you." Daniel's heart sank as he realized what the receptionist had tried to warn him about. A nurse appeared in the doorway, gesturing for him to step outside. "Early onset dementia," she explained quietly. "The fall accelerated her decline. Some days are better than others, but..." She glanced at Eleanor, who had turned back to the window. "She gets very confused about time. Keeps talking about her husband as if he's still alive, about going to wave at the palace guards tomorrow." "Will she recover?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. The nurse's silence was answer enough. Back in Eleanor's room, Daniel noticed a photograph on her bedside table. It showed a much younger Eleanor standing beside a man in military dress uniform. They were both beaming at the camera, their happiness frozen in time. "That's my Harold," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice stronger. "He understood about duty. About standing guard. That's why I..." She frowned, reaching for a memory that seemed to slip away like smoke. "There was a young guard. I used to..." "You used to wave to him," Daniel finished gently. "Every morning." "Yes." She smiled, though her eyes remained distant. "Every morning. He reminded me of Harold. So straight and tall. So dedicated. I wanted him to know that someone understood. That someone saw him." Her voice trailed off, and she turned back to the window, lost once again in her private world. Daniel stood there, his throat tight with emotion. All this time, he had thought she was just a lonely old woman seeking connection. Instead, she had been offering understanding, acknowledgement, respect, not just to him, but to the memory of her husband and every other person who had ever stood guard out of duty and dedication. As he left Meadowbrook that evening, Daniel made a silent promise. Eleanor had spent years acknowledging his duty. Now it was his turn to acknowledge hers. The morning light filtered through the blinds of room 214, casting striped shadows across Eleanor's face as Daniel pulled up a chair beside her. It was his first official visit since discovering her whereabouts, and he had traded his ceremonial uniform for civilian clothes, a decision he immediately regretted when he saw the blank look in her eyes. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said softly, using her first name as the nurses had encouraged. "I'm Daniel, the guard from—" "Oh, is it time for breakfast already?" she interrupted, glancing around the room with mild confusion. "Harold always likes his eggs perfectly done. He has to be at his post early, you see." Daniel's heart constricted. The nurse had warned him about this, how Eleanor's mind now drifted between past and present like a boat untethered from its moorings. She lived primarily in memories from decades ago, when her husband was still alive and her world was whole. "Sarah," Eleanor called out suddenly to no one in particular, "make sure to polish Harold's buttons. He has inspection today." Her hands moved in her lap, going through the motions of polishing invisible brass buttons with a cloth that wasn't there. The head nurse, Margaret, appeared in the doorway, her experienced eyes taking in the scene. "She's having one of her more confused days," she explained quietly to Daniel. "The mornings are usually hardest. Her mind tries to follow old routines, but—" Daniel nodded, remembering Eleanor's own morning routine at the palace. How precisely timed it had been, how purposeful. Now he understood that it had been more than just a ritual. It had been an anchor, keeping her connected to the present even as her mind began to slip away. As the morning progressed, Daniel watched Eleanor drift through different periods of her life. One moment she was a young wife, waiting for Harold to return from duty. The next, she was planning her son's wedding, explaining to Daniel in detail about flower arrangements and seating charts. The son, he learned from Margaret, had passed away 5 years ago, another loss Eleanor's mind now mercifully allowed her to forget. "The hardest part," Margaret confided during a moment when Eleanor had dozed off, "is that she occasionally has moments of complete clarity. They never last long, but they're enough to make her aware of everything she's losing. Those are the times when she cries for hours." Around midday, Eleanor became agitated, insisting she needed to leave. "I have to go to the palace," she declared, attempting to rise from her chair. "He'll be waiting for me. The young guard, he expects me to be there." "Mrs. Eleanor," Daniel tried, his voice catching. "I'm here. I'm the guard you're thinking of." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time that day, but there was no recognition in her gaze. No, you don't understand. He stands so still, like my Harold used to. Never moves a muscle, so dedicated to his duty. I have to be there. I have to wave. He needs to know someone understands." It took both Daniel and a nurse to calm her, to convince her to sit back down. As she settled, her agitation faded into confusion, then into a distant melancholy. "Harold?" she whispered. "Is that you?" Daniel spent the afternoon reading to her from a book of poetry the nurses said she particularly enjoyed. Though she rarely seemed to follow the words, she would occasionally murmur lines along with him, muscle memory carrying her through verses she had once known by heart. As the day wore on, Daniel noticed small details that broke his heart. The way her room was decorated with photos she no longer recognized, the carefully labeled drawers to help her find her clothes, the calendar with large printed numbers that held no meaning for her anymore. On her bedside table, a half-drunk cup of tea had gone cold, chai with extra ginger, no sugar. Just before dinner, Eleanor had what Margaret called a sundown moment, a brief period of lucidity that sometimes occurred as day faded into evening. She looked at Daniel with suddenly clear eyes, her face etched with an awareness that hadn't been there all day. "I know you," she said quietly. "From the palace gates. You're the young guard I used to wave to." Daniel leaned forward, hope rising in his chest. Yes, that's right. I'm not well, am I?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I keep forgetting things. Important things. Sometimes I know I'm forgetting, but I can't. I can't hold on to them." Tears welled in her eyes. "It's slipping away, all of it. Even Harold, I know he's gone, but sometimes I forget that too, and then I remember all over again." "It's all right," Daniel said, taking her frail hand in his. "You don't have to remember everything." "But I want to," she whispered. I want to remember you, standing there so straight and tall. I want to remember why it was important to wave every day. There was a reason, wasn't there?" Before Daniel could answer, the clarity in her eyes began to fade, like sun disappearing behind clouds. She withdrew her hand from his and turned to stare out the window, her momentary connection to the present already lost. "Harold will be home soon," she said vaguely. "He never likes his dinner to be late." Daniel sat back in his chair, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. The woman who had stood so proudly at the palace gates, who had made his duty feel meaningful with her daily acknowledgement, was slowly disappearing into the mists of her own mind. Yet somehow, even in her confusion, she held on to the essence of who she was, someone who understood duty, dedication, and the importance of being seen. As he left that evening, Daniel paused at the nurse's station. "I'd like to visit again," he said. "Regularly, if that's allowed." Margaret smiled sadly. "She won't always know who you are." "That's all right," Daniel replied, straightening his shoulders unconsciously into his guard's posture. "She spent years seeing me. Now it's my turn to see her." Winter melted into spring, and Daniel's visits to Meadowbrook became as regular as Eleanor's trips to the palace had once been. Every morning before his shift, he would arrive at 7:30 a.m., bringing with him a cup of chai from Mr. Patel's cart, extra ginger, no sugar. Sometimes Eleanor would drink it, other times she would stare at it as if trying to remember why it felt familiar. The staff had grown used to seeing him in his full ceremonial uniform, understanding that the sight of it sometimes helped trigger Eleanor's memories. They'd created a routine around his visits, ensuring Eleanor was dressed and seated by the window when he arrived. "Tell me about the palace again," she would often say, even on days when she didn't recognize him. So Daniel would describe the changing of the guard, the tourists, the magnificent gates. He'd tell her about the flowers blooming in the palace gardens, the parades, the ceremonies. Sometimes he'd share funny stories about tourists trying to make the guards laugh or the occasional bird that would perch on their bearskin caps. On this particular morning, spring sunshine streamed through the window as Daniel recounted a story he told her many times before. "And there was this elderly lady," he said, watching her face carefully, "who used to come every single day. What happened to her?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about her own story. "She was the kindest person I've ever met," Daniel continued, his voice soft. "She understood something that most people don't, that sometimes the greatest act of kindness is simply acknowledging someone's dedication." Throughout his visits, Daniel had learned to navigate the unpredictable waters of Eleanor's memory. He'd discovered that music often reached her when words couldn't. He'd brought in an old record player, and some vinyl records from the era when she and Harold were young. On good days, she would hum along. On better days, she would share snippets of memories the songs evoked. The nurses had noticed a change in Eleanor since Daniel's visits began. While her condition continued to progress, she seemed more settled, less prone to the aggressive confusion that often accompanied dementia. They told Daniel that she talked about her soldier, even on days when she couldn't remember his name or face. One nurse, Jenny, had taken to keeping a journal of Eleanor's more lucid moments. "She said something interesting yesterday," Jenny told Daniel as he signed in for his visit. "She said she used to wave at the palace guard because everyone needs someone to wave back to, even if they can't wave back." Daniel carried these small insights with him like precious gems, each one helping him understand more about the woman who had touched his life so profoundly. He learned that she had been a nurse during her younger years, that she and Harold had traveled the world before settling in London, that they had survived hardships together that would have broken lesser spirits. Some mornings, Eleanor would be lost in darker memories. The day she learned of Harold's passing, the loss of their only son, the first time she noticed her memories slipping away. During these times, Daniel would simply sit with her, his steady presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. He continued his palace duties with the same dedication, but now he understood even better what Eleanor had tried to teach him, that behind every uniform, every duty, every ritual, there was a human story waiting to be acknowledged. Then came the morning that changed everything. It had started like any other visit. Daniel arrived in his uniform, chai in hand, finding Eleanor in her usual spot by the window. She had been particularly distant that day, barely responding to his presence. He sat with her anyway, describing the early morning light on the palace gates, the way the dew made everything sparkle. Suddenly, she turned to him with an intensity he hadn't seen in months. "You're my soldier, aren't you?" she whispered, reaching out to touch his sleeve. The clarity in her eyes was startling. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. "Yes," he managed to say. "Yes, I am. I remember now," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I used to wave to you every morning. You never waved back, you couldn't, of course. But you saw me. Just like Harold used to see me, even when he was standing at attention." Tears threatened to blur Daniel's vision, but he maintained his guard's composure. "You saw me too," he said softly. "When everyone else just saw the uniform." Eleanor smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and erased years from her face. "We understood each other, didn't we? About duty and dedication. About standing tall even when it's difficult." Her hand found his, squeezing with surprising strength. "Thank you for coming back for me." For one precious moment, they sat together in perfect understanding. Then, like a candle flickering in the wind, the clarity began to fade from Eleanor's eyes. She turned back to the window, her hands slipping from his, and began humming a tune from her youth. The moment was gone, but it had been real. Daniel sat back in his chair, his heart full. In that brief exchange, Eleanor had given him one final gift, the knowledge that somewhere in her mind, she remembered. She understood. She knew she wasn't alone. As he left Meadowbrook that morning to head to his shift at the palace, Daniel realized that his uniform felt different, lighter somehow. Eleanor's moment of recognition had transformed their silent bond into something even more meaningful. She had waved to him for years, acknowledging his dedication. Now he visited her every day, acknowledging hers. Some battles couldn't be won, Daniel knew. Eleanor's condition would continue to progress, the fog in her mind would grow thicker. But in that one clear moment, she had proved what he had always believed, that true connection transcends duty, uniform, and even the barriers of a failing mind. The call came on a winter morning that seemed no different from any other. Daniel was adjusting his uniform before his shift when his phone buzzed. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and somehow, before he even answered, he knew. Eleanor had passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had been listening to one of her favorite records, a melody from the 1940s that she and Harold had danced to at their wedding. The nurses said she had been humming along softly, a small smile on her face, as if remembering something beautiful. When Daniel arrived at Meadowbrook, room 214 was already being cleared. Eleanor's few possessions were packed neatly in boxes: photo albums, Harold's military medals, the record player Daniel had brought her. On her bedside table, he found a note card written in Jenny's careful handwriting, documenting Eleanor's last lucid words from the previous evening. "Tell my soldier thank you for seeing me." The funeral was held 3 days later at a small church near the palace. Daniel had worried that few people would attend. Eleanor's son had passed years ago, and she had outlived most of her contemporaries. But as he arrived in his full ceremonial uniform, he was surprised to see the church filling with familiar faces. Mr. Patel was there, his tea cart closed for the morning in Eleanor's honor. The flower vendor who had worked near Eleanor's usual spots sat quietly in a back pew. Several of the local shopkeepers and regular passers-by who had known Eleanor from her daily palace visits had come to pay their respects. Even Private Jenkins, who had once dismissed her as a barmy old bird, stood solemnly in his uniform. The nursing home staff filled an entire row: Margaret, Jenny, and others who had cared for Eleanor in her final months. They had brought with them the journal of Eleanor's lucid moments, now a precious record of her last clear thoughts and memories. As the service began, the priest spoke of Eleanor's life, her years as a nurse, her devotion to her husband Harold, their travels around the world. But it was when he mentioned her daily visits to the palace that Daniel felt his throat tighten. "For 5 years," the priest said, Eleanor Thompson stood outside the palace gates every morning, waving to the guards. Some might have seen this as a simple habit of an elderly woman, but those who knew her understood it was much more. It was an act of recognition, of respect, of understanding what it means to stand in service to something greater than oneself. After the service, Jenny approached Daniel with a small box. "We found this among her things," she said. She was quite insistent, during one of her clear moments, that it should go to her soldier. Inside the box was Harold's military pocket watch, perfectly preserved. Attached was a note in Eleanor's shaky handwriting. For the young guard who understood. Time is precious, but duty is timeless. The cemetery was small and peaceful, with a clear view of the palace in the distance. As Eleanor's coffin was lowered into the ground beside Harold's grave, a surprising thing happened. Without any prior coordination, Daniel and the other guards present all raised their hands in a formal salute, a gesture normally reserved for military personnel. When the other mourners had left, Daniel remained. He stood at attention beside Eleanor's grave, as straight and still as he had stood at his post all those mornings. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand in one final wave, breaking protocol not because he had forgotten his training, but because he had learned something even more important from Eleanor about the human heart that beats beneath every uniform. In the months that followed, Daniel noticed changes in how he performed his duties. He stood just as still, maintained the same impeccable standards, but he saw the crowds differently now. In every face that passed, he looked for the same quality he had seen in Eleanor, the capacity to recognize the humanity in ritual, the person behind the protocol. A year after Eleanor's passing, Daniel was promoted to head guard for his section. During his acceptance speech, he did something unprecedented. He told Eleanor's story. He spoke about the elderly woman who had taught him that true strength lies not just in standing firm, but in recognizing those who stand with you. The palace erected a small plaque near the spot where Eleanor used to stand. It read simply, "In memory of Eleanor Thompson, who reminded us daily that every act of duty deserves to be seen." Tourists often asked about it, and the story began to spread among the guards and local community. On quiet mornings, when the sun hits the palace gates just right, some say they can still sense Eleanor's presence, not as a ghost, but as a reminder that behind every uniform, every duty, every silent vigil, there beats a human heart worthy of acknowledgement. Daniel continued his service at the palace with renewed purpose. Every morning, as he marched to his post, he would glance at Harold's pocket watch, now his most treasured possession. And though he maintained perfect composure, in his heart he was waving, to Eleanor's memory, to the duty she had honored, and to the legacy of understanding she had left behind. For in the end, Eleanor had given him far more than her daily waves. She had taught him that the greatest acts of service are often the quietest ones, that true recognition requires no words, and that sometimes the most powerful connections are formed in silence. As the seasons turned and new guards took their posts, Eleanor's story became part of the unofficial training, a reminder that while protocol demands stillness, humanity demands recognition. And somewhere, Daniel liked to think, Eleanor was smiling, pleased that her simple act of waving had created ripples that would continue long after both she and he had finished their final watch.